Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jasmine Poyan. I'm a third-year student here at the UCLA School of Law. I'll be moderating the panel, which really means I'm just going to be introducing our esteemed panelists and letting them run the show. Telling us about, or talking to us about whiteness, its property, lessons on property, and racial privilege. Without further ado, I want to make sure we give all the time we have to the panelists. I want to introduce them by name each, and then I'll introduce them with a really quick bio. Their full bios are in the packet. But today we have Tom Romero, Aleatra Williams, Priya Gupta, and Shirley Thompson. First off is Tom Romero. He is a professor of law and history at the University of Denver. He'll be presenting or talking about his work called Teaching Whiteness as the Property Curriculum. Without further ado, Tom.
Is it okay if I sit here? Just talk to you here?
Yeah, so just so everybody knows, we are recording the panel, so you are, I believe, within sight of the room. So if you want to sit there, that'd be great.
It feels more natural to speak this way. So, well, thank you all for being here. As I get the sense, many of you have sort of already been inspired by many of the discussions and obviously by this work, Whiteness is Property. A couple quick questions. How many of you are students in this class? Or in this class and then here at the law school. So a couple students. All right, the rest of you are faculty, graduate students. All right, a couple graduates. All right, I'm trying to get a sense of my audience. So I'm going to talk about today is the way that we can use whiteness as property as one of the core foundational texts in the first year property curriculum. This, I think, will sort of fit very nicely with the next big plenary panel that happens after lunch. And we talk about teaching as whiteness, but oftentimes this article is either talked about in a critical race theory class, it's talked about in a law and race class, it's talked about in a special seminar like Rose Cuisin-Villazor is doing at UC Davis, in a property and law seminar. So I want to talk about how I've used whiteness as property as a core foundational text. And so my talk today, my probably 14 minutes, maybe 13 and a half minutes that I have left here, I have three sort of parts of this talk. The first is to talk generally about me and sort of in a CRIT mode, in a CRT mode, to talk about myself and how I came to use this text and some of the responses of some of my students. The second part is I want to talk about how I then structure the whiteness as property as a foundational text in the class, and I'll walk you through some of the ways that I do that. And then the third part is I want to talk with you about overcoming objections. As you can imagine, so I'll start here. This text, particularly teaching in largely white institutions with largely white student bodies, creates much consternation, much emotional violence. I'll go there, and certainly much resistance on the part of students to engaging with this text. So let me actually start there and tell you a little bit about some of the experiences of some of my students. I've been teaching Whiteness as Property as one of the first texts that my students get in 14 different semesters of teaching property. I've been teaching the first year property curriculum over the course of the last 10 years. Some semesters I've had 2 sections, one semester I had 3 sections, most semesters I have 1 section, which is radically different. And these are some of the experiences that I've had over the years with some of my students. I've had a woman who's come up to me after reading this text and right before class just could not agree with some of the premises and started nitpicking a lot of the footnotes. And was saying, well, this footnote says this, and this footnote says that. I just don't agree. I don't agree with that. And I've had other students who come to me after class and then during my office hours, and they began to have a dialogue with me about why is this text important? And I had one student who said, this text became clear for me when I was able to sort of put it in the Harry Potter world. And what this meant was that whites were wizards, right? And everybody else was muggles. And so that was the way, and this was actually a person with a PhD in engineering, and that's the way they were sort of able to encounter the text. And then the last time I taught this class, and just also to let you know too, I've taught this class, the property course, to both in the institutions I've been in, to full-time law students as well as part-time law students. And the last time I taught this class was an evening section at my institution. And I had a student, it was the day that we were going to talk about this text. It was the second class. And the student walks in, and he comes very close to me, and he's huffing and hawing. And he's glaring at me. And he gets really close to me, and then he walks by, and then he sits down, and he's one of these students that's at the very front. And then he sort of sits back and just starts glaring at me. This is right before class. And so I come up to him and I approach him and I said, "You're having a bad day." And he looks at me and he sort of sits back and he says, "I was offended by that piece." And I sort of asked him, I said, "Well, why were you offended?" And he looks around, he says, "I'm the only one with balls in this class, balls enough in this class to tell you that was a racist piece. That was a racist piece." And you can sort of imagine, right? This is actually the first time I had received such explicit resistance to this text. Most of the other resistance had been in the form of what I described in the first two sorts of encounters. So this conference actually came about at a very timely moment for me in terms of thinking about why I use this text and why this text is so important in terms of how I want to think about, I want my students to think about engaging the property curriculum. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I chose to use this text in the first place. As I tell my students at the very end of the semester, I was one of these law students that hated property. I hated my property professor. I hated what I learned in property class. And guess what? Here I am teaching property, right? And I've taught it all these times. And the reason I hated it was where I went to law school, there really was sort of no connection between what I was learning in the class in relation to what the way that law worked on the ground and my experience with what the law was. It was certainly rooted in concepts and sort of notions of ownership and sort of having a comprehensive scheme of property that was fundamentally different from my experiences growing up as a Chicano in Denver, Colorado, first-generation college student with working-class parents who had just recently come into college ownership, or sort of just recently during my lifetime had come into home ownership, never owned stocks and bonds and intellectual property, and coming into grad school, sort of thinking for the first time of my own ideas as actually having sort of property conceptions. So all those things I struggled with as a law student. And really resisted, at least at a fundamental level, what I was learning in the property class, which was theoretical. We talked about the Coase theorem. If any of you are familiar with the Coase theorem, it's taught in many of the first-year property curriculums to sort of talk about the ways that law and economics can help us sort of define the boundaries between tort and property. So all of these was very unsatisfying to me. And of course, I was also in law school at a time where I was part of a group of law students who felt very disengaged from the law school because of the racial politics that were going on at the law school, at the larger university, in relation to the fact that there were actually all this great race talk going on with the scholarship. So speaking of 20-year anniversaries, I was part of this founding generation of law students that formed the University of Michigan Journal of Race and Law, the first specialized journal on race and law in the country. So all these things are coming together and sort of formulating and sort of in my thoughts about why I was unsatisfied with the property curriculum. So as I became a law professor, I was committed to sort of change that in particular, and to think most importantly about the ways in which property, and in particular, I was struck, right? So I was a law student when I first read Whiteness Property. Cheryl Harris's observation in the very first pages of her article that, quote, the origins of property rights in the United States are rooted in racial domination. And that sort of struck with me. So I want to talk to you about how then in sort of the second part here, how I structure my class. I structure it very much in relation to critical race theory principles. And those principles are sort of grounded in sort of four methodological principles, or four commitments, if you will, right? To sort of thinking about what is CRT and more precisely what that means in relation to the first year class. So the first principle is that for CRT scholars is they operate from the premise that racial inequality is a salient feature in American society and law. So of course that observation by Harris, right, by Cheryl Harris in the article, seems very clear in terms of teaching about teaching the first year property course. We need to start our conversation in the first year property course the same way that Cheryl Harris does, with Johnson v. McIntosh and with the history and the legacy of slavery, right? And so the two cases that I use to talk about this is the Johnson v. McIntosh case, which was referenced last night, and the Commonwealth v. Aves case, which is a slavery case, an issue about the citizenship of slavery in Massachusetts, a slave who had been brought to Massachusetts by a Louisiana slaveholder. And so what do these cases do for me? What's the work that they do? Well, Johnson v. McIntosh does something really important. You heard about the doctrine of discovery last night. A corollary to the doctrine of discovery is the right of conquest. And if you could talk about the doctrine of discovery as European power, sort of finding a space that is without people, right? A corollary to that is the ability then to be on lands that are literally owned by others, right? Or at least occupied by others. And there's this great line in Johnson v. McIntosh in which John Marshall talks about, in particular, and sort of this is something I beat to my students over the course of the semester, because it gets to the sort of positive notions of property law, the state being able to define what property rights are. In the courts of the conqueror, the law of the conqueror shall not be denied. In the courts of the conqueror, the law of the conqueror shall not be denied. So what does that do for me? The work that it does for me is obviously sets up the fact that the occupation, the quote-unquote property practices of indigenous peoples, right, cannot be respected, right, in this, what emerges as American legal system. And in fact, all our notions of property, right, should be destabilized because they're sort of based in this, in a very positive notion of the state defining property. And of course here it's a colonial state. In the Commonwealth v. Aves case, this slavery case involves a slave that was brought to Massachusetts by her Louisiana slaveholder, interrogates this question about the sort of positive notions of how we define property in relation to what's Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, which is within it is the comity clause, the clause that respects, is supposed to respect the property rights that one state has in relation to those property rights that would exist in another state. So the argument is that if slaves are considered property in Louisiana, they should be considered property in Massachusetts. And in the Commonwealth v. Aves case, Justice Story on the Massachusetts Supreme Court rejects that notion, rejects the comity clause, and does so in relation to natural law principles. So here at this point, I'm able to sort of interrogate that positive notion of the creation of property in relation to a more universal notion of property. And so what that then does is it allows me to get into the second sort of foundational principle, a foundational pillar of CRT work, is that race is culturally and socially contingent, right? And so here is where Whiteness Property serves as a foundational text in terms of, and you heard about it today, property as theory, right? So I'm able to use Cheryl Harris in relation to John Locke, Cheryl Harris in relation to Hohlfeld, Cheryl Harris in relation to Pufendorf, all these so-called property scholars, right? And of course, what she does in that work is she also situates her argument in relation to these property theories to get us from a notion of tangibility to intangibility. So of course, we can talk about that in relation to the fact that property is, well, race and property are socially and historically contingent. The third foundational principle of CRT is that operates from the fact that racial formation is interdependent with multiple racial taxonomies and other social inequalities. So here, this piece allows me to get into questions of social inequality in marital property, for instance, right? I get to talk about gender. I get to talk about sexual orientation. In terms of land use planning, I get to talk about class. And so those are two pieces. I'm trying to rush through as I have like about 30 seconds probably.
Yeah.
But the fourth foundational piece here is that CRT scholars believe that racial justice in the law occurs largely when the interests of whites convene with those of people of color, right? It's the interest convergence theory of Derek Bell. So I get to take two examples. The takings example, and I demonstrate, some of you might have been familiar with the Kilo case that happened a few years ago in Connecticut. This white woman homeowner who had her property taken as a result of economic redevelopment. And I tie the sort of the national consternation that occurred coming out of that case within a long history of racial displacement, right? And of takings of property. If you go back to Johnson v. McIntosh, right? All the way to urban redevelopment of Black and Latino neighborhoods in the 1950s and 1960s. And of course, more recently to the housing and the banking crisis. So I'm able to talk about the ways that the property interests of whites and how they converge with those of people of color, and how that leads to innovations and changes in property law. So very quickly, how do I tie it all together? I do it in relation to my work and my experience when I was working with squatters in Peru back in the late 1990s. And I used Robert Nerwith's Shadow Cities as a text that my students have to read for the final. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but I want my students to also think about the worldwide implications of what it means to call something property in context of people that are, as Robert Nerwith talks about, driving the most fundamental and profound changes in our nation's urban cores, in the world's urban corridors and cores. All right, and so I will leave it to Q&A to talk about how we might overcome objections that my students have to all this. Very 15 minutes. Great. So thank you, and I'll turn it on. So.
Do I need to?
So I'll go up there with you to get your PowerPoint started.
Okay.
So our next panelist is Aleatra Williams. She is an associate professor at the Charleston School of Law and will be presenting on her work called Lending Discrimination, the Foreclosure Crisis, the Perpetuation of Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Homeownership in the U.S.
That is a mouthful. I have been wanting to write this article for 3 years, but I've sort of shied away from it because it was so personal to me. It was something that was hit very close to home, and I needed more time to actually sit back and reflect on why this issue was very important to me. And I've always felt, well, not always, as an adult and as I started teaching property, I started realizing that home ownership is a civil rights issue. It was something that fair access to homes or credit was something that was born out of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. So I started going back to that, and then I started thinking about, well, okay, what has happened before the foreclosure crisis? And so I went through and started looking at the American dream, right? Because you have this saying that the value of home ownership is deeply ingrained in the American public culture, from early laws requiring land ownership for the right to vote, to the 19th century homestead legislation, to contemporary real estate brochures. The ownership of a home has long been presented as a crucial part of the stake and society expected of full-fledged members of the American communities. And so I thought, well, what about those people who are excluded from home ownership for various reasons? Are they not members of the American communities? And my ultimate response is, no, they're not, until they're given the right to have rights to home ownership. So I started looking at all of the housing policies that existed, and I did this historical, I guess, survey from 1900 onward, when you could track how home ownership was held. And in 1913, you had the Revenue Act of 1913, which allowed homeowners to, I guess, count as deductions their mortgage interest paid. Then you had in 1933, at the urging of Franklin Roosevelt, the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, where redlining was born out of, because this gave homeowners access to credit. But it was decided that African Americans, who were the largest minority group at that time, couldn't qualify because they only earned maybe $1,500 a month, and they couldn't possibly afford all of the responsibilities of home ownership and their other responsibilities. So redlining occurred. Lenders began to draw lines around minority neighborhoods and would not lend to those areas. Then you had the Housing Act of 1949, and that was by President Truman. And in this, he said that he wanted to establish as a national objective the achievement as soon as feasible of a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. And then this set forth, it was set forth policies to advance that goal, and they wanted to make these consistent with American ideals and traditions. Well, I underline here every American, because when this became, an issue, it was found out, wait a minute, this didn't include every American. It left out African American, it left out Asian Americans, it left out Latinos. So it wasn't until 1954 that minorities were included under the goal of being homeowners under the national policies. So you have in 1953, President Eisenhower put together this advisory committee on housing policies and programs. And what was interesting about this committee, it was it was solely a Caucasian committee, but they were very adamant in their report, whereby they stated that too often the opportunities of minority families to obtain adequate housing are extremely limited or non-existent. They went, I'll make it so you can hopefully see that a little better. And it then goes on to say, too often the workings of our free economy do not provide solutions that benefit minorities. So what President Eisenhower decided to do was take the advice of the advisory committee, or at least try to take the advice of the advisory committee, where they said that we needed to change the attitude of private investor. That's where you got your loan. You went down to the local S&L and you applied for a mortgage for your property, but many times African Americans were not included in that, or any other minority group. And then the group said, not only must you change it, but it has to be bolstered by vigorous administrative practice. So let's do something, Mr. President, and let's get homeowners, more homeowners, minorities into homes. So we came up, President Eisenhower signed into law the Housing Act of 1954, and it extended, like I said earlier, or attempted to extend the privileges of home ownership, or the encouragement of home ownership, to minorities. And it says every part of our country, and that was literally every part of the country. I'm going to try to go through all of these. In 1968, you had the Fair Housing Act, and we all know that 1968 was a time of turmoil in the U.S., the 1960s period. And in 1968, you had a lot of laws that came out, and the Fair Housing Act came about, and you had the goal of expanding home ownership and equal access to credit and other housing opportunities. And then I sort of talked about the 1970s and 80s, but I'm going to skip ahead to a little more contemporary times. In 1994, you have President Clinton, who put on his platform the National Home Ownership Strategy. And in this, his goal was to increase home ownership up to 8 million, and to also include it in their research fair lending to see what the practices were. Home ownership actually did increase. It didn't reach the 8 million mark, but it came close. But a lot of people blame this strategy as causing the housing crisis that we are now in because it gave easy access to credit. So I say that for a reason because I want to look at the home ownership rates from this time to where they are, to where they were in 2013. Then you have President Bush, who created on his platform, the Ownership Society. And he said that the goal of the Ownership Society is to have more people owning their homes because it is a natural interest that more people own their own homes. Isn't he eloquent? Anyway, this is what he included on his record of achievement. Anyway, it sort of echoes what was stated in previous years. So how did it fare out? And I know that this may be hard to see, and I will allow the slides to be posted wherever they may be posted, if at all, but I'll make them available to anyone who wants to. But I look at the home ownership rates for Caucasians, the home ownership rates for African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians. And from 1996 is over here through 1999. So in 1996, 70% of Caucasians own their homes. African Americans, 44.1, Latinos, 42.8, Asians, 50.8. I want to skip down to 1999. 73.2% of Caucasians own their own homes, 46.3 African Americans, 45.5 Latinos own their homes, and 53.1 own their own homes. Now, looking at the highest rates for all of these groups. From 2000 to 2009, Caucasians own at the highest 76.2%. I thought that was pretty impressive. Then African Americans, 49.7%, and never have African Americans cross the 50% thresholds. Latinos were able to reach 50%, but that's the highest rate that they have ever reached between this time frame. And 60.1% of Asians own their own homes during that time frame. So what happened? You had lending discrimination is not something that's new. HUD conducts many surveys every 10 years, and they always find incidences of lending discrimination. What they'll do is put up they'll set up, it's called a pair study, where they have people with identical profiles basically try to seek credit. And in most cases, they do find some discrimination under the Fair Housing Act or the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So what happened? You had stratified lending opportunities that was ongoing during the crisis, and the crisis is deemed, are you serious? She just said 5 minutes. All right. Stratified lending opportunities, and what I mean by that is when you look at where most of the subprime mortgages were made available, when you had a community that was a majority minority community, 47% of those borrowers were given subprime credit or subprime mortgages. When you had a community that was predominantly Caucasian, only 22% of those borrowers had subprime mortgages or high-cost mortgages. Now, this in and of itself is not evidence of lending discrimination, but it sets forth to me a rebuttable presumption that there could be some lending discrimination. And normally we just have anecdotal evidence of lending discrimination, but now we have actual pursuit of lending discrimination. So one of the major cases that was taken on by the Fair Lending Unit of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice was the countrywide case in 2011, And the argument was that Countrywide had engaged in systemic acts of discrimination based on race, national origin, marital status, when they were lending mortgages between the time of 2006 and 2009. So it said that these lending policies permitted it to target Hispanic and African American mortgagors by placing them in subprime mortgages and then charging them higher loan fees and costs when you look at similarly situated mortgagors. And here's the kicker. It was alleged that there were over 200,000 victims of this practice. So what happened? There was a settlement for $335 million. Now that, to me, seems like a lot. But when you look at what they received in bailout money, it doesn't really compare when they got billions of dollars. But let's move on. You have the Wells Fargo case where they alleged 30,000 minority borrowers were given higher fees and higher rates between the years 2004 and 2009. And it says that, or the pleading says that the Wells Fargo encouraged at least 4,000 minority borrowers into taking subprime mortgages when they could have probably qualified for a higher or lower interest rate. And this case was settled for $175 million. And then you have the SunTrust case in 2012 also, where the settlement was $21 million for engaging in some fair lending violations. So how does it translate when you look at the foreclosure numbers? You have to look at how many loans were originated between the relevant time. And so 8% of the loans were that were originated for minorities, in particular African Americans and Latinos, between the time of 2008. 8% of those loan originations were foreclosed upon, whereas 4.5% of Caucasians, the time is throwing me off, y'all, sorry. 4.5% of the loans originated between this time by Caucasians were foreclosed upon as well. Out of the 2.5 billion foreclosures, this is how the numbers played out. You see that a large number is for Caucasians, this 56%, and it's a lower number for African American and Latinos. And there's a dearth of information on Asians because I guess if you look at what was talked about last night, it's sort of excluding Asians from the minority category, some researchers do. But here, even though the number is higher for Caucasians, the impact is much greater on African American and Latinos because they own less homes. So you look at how many homes were lost, it translates, according to one author, into $98 million lost. But what's the big deal? And I'm going to skip that since I have 2 minutes. What's the big deal? You have a change in net worth. And if you look at what the net worth was over time, and I don't know why that deleted itself, that should be $168,000 for Asians. It dropped all the way down to, let me find my notes because that's not where it should be, to $113,000. Then you have, or lower than 113, 86,000, I believe. Then you have African Americans whose net worth was $12,124. This is so different than my clicker. It dropped all the way down to about $5,800. And then Latinos was $18,359, dropped down to $6,000. This made me think about, well, what does home equity, what effect does that have on your net worth? And for Caucasians, home equity only comprises 38% of their entire net worth. They get 62% from other, I guess, I don't know, talk to me, that's my time. But you look at African Americans, it's 38%, and then you look at Latinos. So my whole point of writing this article is that despite all of these housing policies that are in place, or maybe because of these housing policies, minorities became victimized by the lending process. And it became more evident during the foreclosure crisis because the effects the drop in wealth loss. You have lower home ownership rates. And there are studies out there that say, particularly for African Americans, once they're out of home ownership due to foreclosure, they're not likely to return again. You have furthered segregation because mobility is lost. You can't have access to credit, and especially in light of what the government has tried to do through the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with the new revised regulation of the Truth in Lending Act. We have the ability to repay rule, and it requires that the debt-income ratio does not outbalance 43%. Normally that's okay, but now we include student loans as a part of that. And most minority students cannot afford to go to college without student loans. And so if you add that into the whole equation, they have to choose, do I go to college or do I buy a home? And so those choices then increase the gaps in home ownership in the U.S. for minorities. And I do have a lot more to say, but there's just no time. So ask me any question that you want, and I really do appreciate any feedback that you have to offer, because this article has been accepted for publication, but it's one that I'm likely to keep writing forever and ever. So, all right, thank you guys. All right. I want to shut the system down. That sounds really bad, so I'll leave it.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so our next panelist is Priya Gupta. She's an associate professor at the Southwestern Law School and will be presenting her work called Governing the Single Family House, a Brief Legal History.
Thank you so much. And I'll keep my own time because times just make me nervous, so I have to worry.
Okay.
Okay. So our presentations fit together so well, it's like we planned it. So they could just fit together like this. We could have interspersed our slides. So I start with looking at the news today and trying to figure out where all these crises come from. So we have Detroit, which used to be booming, we all know, now enters bankruptcy. We have the reduction in wealth for different minority groups that Aleatra covered so well. And we have also the lower rates of home ownership with whites and Latinos versus blacks and Latinos versus whites. And then also we have this recent statement about Fannie and Freddie's new goals in terms of low-income lending and low-income housing, which are not significantly different than they were in the past. And so my project begins with a question, well, how are all these crises related, and what can we study to draw out those relations? So while Alicia's presentation looked at housing overall and home ownership, I'm asking you to think about, well, what comes into your mind when you hear home ownership? So what picture is painted in your mind as soon as she began to talk about home ownership? Well, probably it's some version of the single family house. So some version of this neat little house that's detached, exists on its own, it's got a little lawn, it's got one nuclear family that lives in it, which means 2 generations, and it's got a bunch of other design features that we'll go into. So what I do then is I look at that house and how pervasive it is in our housing stock. So in 1940, 63% of our housing stock was that single family house. And in 2000, the number's around 60%. So it hasn't really changed. There's been a lot of talk about the new form of the suburb and new urbanization efforts, But I want to take us back to how that house became so embedded as our norm, right? As the norm that we think of in terms of home ownership. So my argument then is that this housing inequality and the related crises that we just discussed are not random phenomena or the results of a free market, but the inevitable results of a century's worth of deliberate policy choices, all of them aimed at inscribing a particular societal structure, the suburban nuclear family, into the physical landscape of American housing. So Alicia posed a question just as she was closing about whether it was despite of or because of government policy that home ownership has been so unequal over the decades, and I'm arguing that it's because of. And so, how do I do that? Well, I use the house itself to then explore the political economic history of the states. In particular, I look at discrimination and these crises that I just laid out. And so here's what I'm looking at. So this is obviously a bigger project that you guys are getting a piece of today. When I began to engage with this a few years ago, I found that there was a lot of literature, lots of literature, legal literature and elsewhere, that talked about the construction of suburbia, and it focused primarily on laws and regulation. So there's a lot written about the New Deal and the different housing programs that were put into place, and there's a lot written about exclusionary zoning, right? Because if we're looking at the single-family house, we of course also have to look at where it's located, which is the American suburb. And so what I do is I draw on legal realism, and this is also what brought me to Cheryl Harris's piece, to look at how we can study the values articulated in those moments and in the cases, particularly with exclusionary zoning. And also how the government deliberately masked the amount of support that they were giving to white nuclear families as free market. So some of the programs that Aleatra talked about and that I'm going to talk about also were not just sold to the public as, oh, we want to encourage homeownership for white people. They actually were sold to the public as, oh, we just need to unleash the capital that's already there, and we need to help the market do what the market's going to do. And so what I've been doing is looking at some of the historical documents that I'll talk about to see how exactly that was packaged rhetorically. And so we see then that the way that was sold to the public, as opposed to welfare, which was always sold as this sort of charitable effort that the haves are so graciously giving to the have-nots, then constructed those people a certain way. And so in order to do that, I don't focus primarily on the laws and the regulations, which I think a lot of the literature does, but I try to get this by looking at the physical structure of the house. So how is it that we can look at the architecture of the house and planning of suburbs to then draw this out, to then draw out exactly what was embedded in that, and then what continues to be inscribed in the physical landscape when we think about how pervasive the single-family house is and the suburb is still today. Okay, so the larger project is this. We're only going to do Roman numeral 1 today. But the larger project looks at the actual house, and then it fills that house with a nuclear family, and then it locates the house in the suburb to talk about how the suburbs themselves were planned, and then they incorporated on their own, and that's where I get into more of the exclusionary zoning literature. Okay, so here is what we get when we do a Google search for single-family house, single-family detached house, post-war single-family detached house. And the reason why I search for that is even right now, 40% of our housing stock was built before 1970. So we really need to look at the time between 1940 or 1934, let's say, in 1940s and 1970 in particular, to see how this house became the real norm or the goal in American housing. And then finally I look for Levittown because it's just what all people who study houses in America look at. So I had to also. And I wish I had that as a postcard so I could send it to everybody who's been annoyed by me the past few years. But anyways, so we go. Okay, so a brief look at some of the regulations. So during the New Deal, there were a variety of institutions that were established in order to promote homeownership, right? The primary one was the Federal Housing Administration, but of course the VA was involved also, and then the Homeowners Loan Corporation, as Alicia talked about. These organizations were, in part, able to support homeownership because the government was willing to underwrite loans that banks would give for mortgages. They changed the structure of the mortgage, they made it a lot more accessible, and then the government was underwriting the loans, which meant that banks were more willing to lend. So what has been covered in the literature a bit is how the 1936 manual from the FHA that was looking at the underwriting policies and how they would assess loans that were going to be given better rates or worse rates, race was an explicit factor. So if a loan was going to be made to a family or a person that was going to buy a man, actually, it had to be a man, but a man in a place where there was adverse racial factors, then the loan wouldn't be given as high of a rating, which meant that the banks would have to pay more for the underwriting, right? Because underwriting is like insurance for a loan. And so therefore, of course, banks are not going to be as willing to lend, and if they are, it's going to be at higher rates. So that's been covered a bit by the literature. That was in the 1936 manual. It was a bit in the 1948 manual, and then by 1954, it's not there anymore. So what I've been looking at is what else went along with those manuals. And it's been interesting to find that it's not just the explicit racial factor that we need to look at, because that's not necessarily what ends up living on, right? It's all of the other rhetoric that went into assessing the loans. So we'll talk about it in a second, but there are design choices, and there's a lot to do with privacy, and there's a lot to do with the quietness of the suburb and the neighborhood. And all of these, as many post-colonial scholars have looked at, and scholars who look at Victorian London in particular, all of those are codes that are meant to construct an idyllic suburb as opposed to the messy, dirty, minority city. So that's the way that these manuals in that early history end up living on, because we see that in the cases, we see that in housing policy today, where unashamedly the government will still talk about this idyllic suburb and the rights of the municipalities to define the character of the communities for themselves. There were also a number of projects in support of the single-family house. I don't really go into this right now, but there were highways, and their focus was on promoting the auto industry and not so much mass transit, and support for consumer credit, and loans for returning veterans and so on, that were meant to mean that not only could you buy the house, but you could fill it and you could live in it also. Now, what's been interesting, what was really shocking to me, actually, is that there were design choices. So if we could go back in time and we could ask people in the 1920s what they thought of as homeownership, they might have talked about apartments, or they might have talked about multifamily dwellings, and all of that was done away with. And it wasn't done away with because of free market. It was done away with pretty explicitly by these government allocation of resources, but also within the legislative history of what was going on. So there's a series of hearings that were held in 1947 and 1948, and it was done by a joint committee on housing led by Joe McCarthy. So before he did what he did that we know him for, he led this committee that went around the country and had a number of hearings to talk about home ownership in the U.S. And they specifically steered people away. And then the report that they came out steered the government away from allocating resources towards multifamily housing, or towards even, think about the way that houses could be built, right? We could have shared space, we could have shared kitchens or washing machines or anything, right? Anything to conserve resources. He specifically steered people away from that because he thought anything communal would then be communist and socialist, and he didn't want that, right? Each house should be its own world. And so I have a brief discussion also of the alternatives that were left behind, but I'll move on a bit. So what are the norms then that we find inscribed in the single-family house, right? When we look at the architecture of the house itself and then of the suburb around it, well, separation and seclusion as fulfillment is huge, right? So being separate from other families, being separate from other races, being around people who are like you, but you choose how you interact with them, right? And this is where I draw on the law and geography literature. So I look at some of the critical geographers, a few of which we know are at UCLA, to see, well, how is it that space really constructs our norms? How is it that the spaces that we live in then in some ways shape the lives we live? So we can think about, even our lives. I used to live in New York, so even the life in New York versus LA, and how in New York you're more likely to ride the subway and interact with lots of people, and you're more likely to walk on the street and interact with lots of people. But when you live in a place like LA, perhaps you're more likely to drive a car somewhere and then not interact with people, and perhaps not interact with your neighbors as much because you could choose a place where you don't hear them so much, right? So all of these ways that the space that we live in, yes, it's chosen by us, but only within a certain universe of what's available. And so we see that in the 1940s and then onward, this seclusion and separation really become to take hold in the American imaginary. They existed before that, but before that it was primarily in terms of celebrating the countryside or the frontier. And now all of a sudden the suburb becomes a place for this, right? So we see this in the advertisements. We see this in the way houses are built. Each has its own world: kitchen, yard, climate control, garage for the man to do man things. And then these racial codes of cleanliness and privacy, and even within the manuals, the FHA manuals now, again, I return to themselves, they talk about, well, children should be kept, in their own little children's spaces, or they could have like a little mess room and things like that. Again, because it wasn't supposed to be that the whole house is messy or full of this, that the noise and dirt aspect of even within the family is supposed to be contained. Okay, so what was left out? This is a fairly well-known quote from Euclid. This is how zoning becomes a part of it, right? The development of detached house sections is greatly retarded by the coming of apartment houses, which has sometimes resulted in destroying the entire section for private house purposes. That in such sections, very often the apartment house is a mere parasite, constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of the district. So what I've also been doing is tracing how this language lives on, not in necessarily as colorful a form, but in the ways that zoning is talked about today, even 2011, 2012, about this idea of having Euclid goes on, but having the open spaces and the character of the community. Okay, I only have a minute left, so I will close with this. So in addition to the law and geography stuff, I use that then to take a legal realist approach to how it is that all of this was constructed with this rhetoric of the free market, when we know that there was intense and immense government support. And this is where I again come back to Cheryl Harris by looking at how is it that we can see cracks in the liberal project, right? And so liberals and conservatives all seem to support the idea of homeownership in different ways. But where is it that then the project falls apart when we realize, well, to do that in the way that it's been done ignores the unequal bargaining power that happens between people, ignores the way that the government supports private industry and then takes a step back. So even in this is the website today, talking about post-World War II surge in homeownership. It's passive, right? Who did this? A booming economy, favorable tax laws, a rejuvenated home building industry, and easier financing. As if there was no agent doing this, right? The government itself doesn't take ownership for what it did during and post-war. And so, I know, now I'm over time, but I'll just be 20 seconds and then I'm done. So then what I argue in this part of the paper that sort of also is a thread that runs through it is we really need to take a hard look at this liberal and conservative idea that sort of comes together in this Bootstrap American who helps themselves, and this is what the post-war veteran did when he came home and he found, he made a family and he helped himself to this house, and so now that's what people need to do. They just need to, get up and do it themselves. And I think if we look at the post-war time as a lens to looking at today, we see it a lot more explicitly. It helps us see the rhetoric today, even by seeming well-meaning liberals, and how it is that it's not so simple to call it bootstrap when the government support has been there all along for private industry and for certain people to gain access to single-family houses. Okay, thank you.
I do want to stand up.
I know, yeah.
So our last panelist for our Q&A panel is Shirley Thompson. She's an associate professor in American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. We'll be presenting her work called Playing the Numbers, Quantitative Analysis and the Effort to Establish Property in Blackness.
Thank you. So I want to say a few words from my perspective as a cultural historian about some of the challenges posed by race, property, and quantification, especially for folks who have tried to imagine the terms of Black freedom. So the relationship between race and property has hinged on the techniques by which we distill knowledge of and observations about human bodies and characteristics. The long and foundational project of making whiteness visible and valuable in the U.S. has been one of intensely arraying, such information into seemingly objective and therefore authoritative charts, tables, and graphs. So I'm interested in how property regimes, the various means of marking things off as valuable property, trap non-white and especially Black subjects with informal statistical models that trouble their possibility of agency and their capacity for what historians like to describe as resistance. And I want to read critical race studies as part of a long-standing tradition of attempting to free Blackness from this quantitative trap. I want to excavate this project by examining a key context in which these methodologies emerge, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Plessy versus Ferguson is a cornerstone of this era, the definitive expression of whiteness as status property, as Cheryl Harris details in her article. So just to situate the problem I'm trying to unpack, I attempt to describe in my larger historical work on the problem of property in Black culture that in this period, whiteness and Blackness are caught up in a kind of valorization crisis, a crisis in value. That is one of the most crucial contexts for understanding this era's reformulation of the terms of race is this massive crisis in value brought on by the Civil War in general and by the terms of emancipation in particular. One impetus for this valorization crisis is the federal government's decision in a much less cited part of the 14th Amendment not to compensate enslavers for the loss of their slave property. So as Section 4 of the 14th Amendment reads, neither the U.S. nor any state shall assume or pay any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such claims shall be held illegal and void. So enslaved people representing upwards of $20 billion of the South's wealth, and that's not translated into today's terms, but $20 billion, $1860 of the South's wealth, can no longer be counted on or counted as the most stable holder of value in the wildly speculative economy of the region. So this crisis forms the core of the so-called Negro Problem that dominated the discourse of the latter decades of the 19th century, the era of Plessy. Now that Blacks could not be listed on a plantation ledger or a bill of sale next to an agreed upon sum of money, how could they be counted? Or in other words, when freed from their status as property, did Black people even count? Another important aspect of this crisis moment derives from the frantic search of industrialists and financiers for capital, a compulsion that decimated the Freedmen's Bank, and with it the mutual trust that was beginning to accrue between formerly enslaved people and the financial world. So constituted as a kind of philanthropic enterprise and placed under special federal guidelines, consigned to the protection of a board of directors, the Freedmen's Bank, this place where countless newly emancipated people deposited their military pay, deposited money earned under hard-won labor contracts. So this bank was treated ultimately as a slush fund for a broad range of risky ventures by its so-called board of directors. So the work and the service of Black folks literally came to nothing, had no value, amounted to a kind of worthless property. So that's another part of the crisis. In a related sense, this crisis of race and property value can also be understood as part of a broader 14th Amendment crisis that elevated, or rather edified, the status of corporations as federally protected persons. Although they had held the legal status as artificial persons for almost a century, U.S. corporations in this period, with the help of the 14th Amendment, sort of commandeered the force of that amendment and other instruments to amass even greater amounts of capital in the last decade of the 19th and into the 20th century. Corporate interests developed and harnessed the potential of new technologies, of communication and mobility. They employed legal and political strategies to defend their interests against organized labor and regulation. And their logic seeped well beyond their legally defined boundaries. With cultural historian Alan Trachtenberg, I understand incorporation is both a literal and a figurative process. That is, the culture began to organize itself around and in terms of these transportation, communication, and distribution networks and legal frameworks comprising and buttressing corporate personhood. So within this crisis, corporate culture brought about an acute problem with respect to human persons. And we're continuing to kind of live with this problem. This question, how can people begin to secure their value as agents, as market actors, as political actors, as citizens, in a world that's changeable, filled with abstraction, that prioritizes the impersonal kind of national, sort of frameworks over a human scale of interaction that's familiar and local. We're looking at, kind of how, and how can human persons sort of achieve, kind of recognition with the emergence of large, anonymous, and atomized cities, and the creation of these large and networked corporate bureaucracies. In such settings such as these, the individual human, just setting aside race for a minute, as a valued unit of political and economic activity, is increasingly threatened with erasure and displacement. And it's harder to recognize where that human fits in the economy. So this is the broader context in which whiteness gets to be propped up as an important status property. It's the context in which the value of blackness had been totally obliterated, and personhood in general, natural personhood, human personhood, is also under siege. So in this era, whiteness establishes its own kind of secure embodiment as a fundamental existential norm. As property, it begins to consist of the expectation whereby bodies are provided a kind of support, an organic form, a protected organic form for the soul. So, bodies are kind of sealed off as that which cannot be violated. And it gives the interior, the life of the mind, the soul, a kind of freedom for action, for agency. And so this norm begins to crystallize and attach to whiteness. This is the unspoken kind of existential baseline of social social life. Whiteness signaled bodily integrity, free agency, easy mobility, and confirmed the white agent's freedom in the right to the unmolested exercise of his or her conscience and faculties. So it's through claiming property and whiteness that one begins to achieve legitimacy, legibility, protection from the pervasive slippage of natural persons, and it's how one begins to gain a foothold within this confounding, these new and confounding political and economic structures. And whiteness as a crucial status property is achieved, it's given form through these new sciences and methods, statistical analysis, the collection and arrangement of big data that really begin to establish their own authority in this period through new disciplines like sociology, and how those disciplines get linked up with planning, municipal planning, public policy, and so on and so forth, and corporate interests as well. So what are some of the concrete arenas where this plays out? I've been recently researching the American life insurance industry, in general, and especially the subset of that industry developed by African Americans for African Americans against the grain. And one of the things that strikes me is the prominent but somewhat hidden role that the industry has played in establishing the evidentiary paradigms governing race and in protecting whites from the perils of the market. So life insurance secures white embodiment, it safeguards white futures, it creates a sense of white posterity. I mean, we all know and we've heard, presentations about the role that home insurance, the mortgage industry, and other segments of the financial industry have in building up property value and the personal wealth of white persons, especially in the post-World War II period. But something similar and perhaps more intimate, more proximate to the body is happening in the life insurance industry at the turn of the 19th and in the first couple of decades of the 20th centuries. Take the influential work of Frederick Hoffman, for example. He's not a household name today, but he was a prominent actuary and a popular writer as well. A lot of Americans read his work. At one time, the lead actuary and statistician for Prudential, he promoted premium life insurance policies as a powerful means of securing one's property and whiteness by engineering something called a human life value concept. So by investing in this concept, this way of determining the worth of the, quote, economic forces incorporated within our being, according to an early industry theorist, qualified persons, whites, could rest assured in the future. Their expectations about how the world should work would be backed by law, policy, and confirmed in the market. This was a message that resonated in the context of Jim Crow and U.S. imperialism. As one 1899 industry ad cautioned, quote, insurance takes up the white man's burden. If he isn't insured, he isn't white. In 1896, the same year as Plessy, the same Frederick Hoffman published the wildly popular bestseller called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, and demonstrated in, charts and tables that African Americans constituted what W.E.B. Du Bois described as a problem people rather than a people with problems. These statistics that Hoffman generated effectively held them out of the market for premium insurance products by deeming them too risky to insure. So statistics and quantitative analysis becomes the language and form of everyday common sense about race. As such, it undergirds the evidentiary claims that get deployed in these legal struggles and contests over racial status. Judges and juries frame their assessments in terms of what the numbers show about the social character of racial being in these newly central, anonymous, and depersonalized spaces in the U.S., like cities, railroad cars, and so forth. So to be white is to effectively win and to survive this numbers game, this process of quantification. Whites come out the other side of that and are established as agents of the market. Blacks and are kind of in sort of quasi, not quite white folks are kind of trapped within that at their own peril. So these actuarial methods naturalize the outcomes they produce. They create inequalities and then measure them as objective, unchangeable social fact. They enshrine inequality and racial distinction and the barbarous practices that get sanitized under the phrase separate but equal. They enshrine these things as common sense, beyond the purview of legislation and arbitration, because they're bound up with the fundamental right of individuals to sort themselves out into groups naturally, the way they see fit. Justice Brown, writing for the majority of the court in the Plessy decision, confirms this when he says, legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based on physical differences, because they've been shown as kind of objective by people like Hoffman. And the attempt to do so can only result in accentuating the difficulties of the present situation. And he goes on to say, if one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them on the same plane. So what I'm interested in, and I'm not going to, sort of have an answer today at the beginning of my project, but what I'm interested in is, if it's possible for African Americans to commandeer these crucial strategies for their own benefit, and if so, how did they avoid reinscribing some of the pitfalls of quantification? And insurance was indeed a cornerstone of black race activism. African American insurance moguls created companies that did go against the grain of white supremacy and did effectively extend some of these instruments to black individuals. So they defied this white supremacist logic on the one hand, but on the other, by developing their own actuarial models, they recommitted black souls to the rigid demands of this statistical analysis. And it really was disheartening when I went into the archives of some of these companies and opened the books. And the books are these big ledgers that really reminded me of plantation ledgers and sort of slave trading account books, the archives of slavery. And I was kind of wondering if that's what black freedom and black the possibility of black agency looks like, then we have a problem. We might have a sort of potential problem. What have been the benefits and dangers of playing the numbers game in this way? How can we reframe the evidentiary paradigms constituting racial knowledge? Anti-racist theorists and activists know that quantitative analyses is a double-edged sword and a thorny path down which to seek racial redress and racial justice. At the time, Du Bois, who had substantial faith in sociology and statistics, was fundamentally shaken in his kind of investigation. In fact, he describes after a lynching, trying to write an elaborate sort of case against lynching that he would go to deliver to Joel Chandler Harris, who was on the Atlanta newspaper staff and who was a friend of his. And so he, leaves Atlanta University where he's a professor and walks uptown to deliver this note. And on the way, he passes by a window in which is displayed the knuckles of the guy who was lynched. And he turned around and went back. He was like, no, sort of amount of rationality and reason is going to be effectively, kind of change hearts and minds, like something else is going on. And he begins then to explore and adopt different kinds of methods. And the kind of method that I want to suggest, is, I think, most, kind of has a most possibility in helping us work through this problem is one which critical race theory also picks up. It's, kind of prying apart the numbers in order to make space for narrative, for testimony, for stories, for a different kind of framing that is, kind of born of and out of the wisdom of those people who haven't been able to, kind of, sort of inscribe their own experiences in societal norms or find their experiences there, and who have been, kind of trapped within this, structure of numbers. So I'll just leave it there. We can
All right, so I want to thank all of our panelists and open it up for questions in the audience. So yes.
I have a question for actually Professors Williams and Gupta. I'm an urban educator, and your work with housing is so intrinsically linked into education, with property tax being the gold standard and the idea of the suburbs being the gold standard for education because of that, and home ownership. And have you been able to make those connections, particularly with this idea of constructions of whiteness, and how that then, kind of reifies itself within the context of education or within the context of urban versus suburban spaces and housing?
I actually have, and one part of my article ended up being almost 80 pages long. And so I had to cut it out, but I do have a little part in my article that talks about that as a result of the furtherance of segregation by limited discrimination. I talk about how when you have a lower tax rate or lower tax area, you have less education opportunities. And so I do go into that somewhat.
Yeah, I also found that as soon as I started researching this house, that it can't be talked about without talking about cities. It's just impossible to talk about the house without talking about what happens to cities in order to build those houses. And so one of the more direct links for me was looking at the Wells Fargo case with Baltimore. So Baltimore sues Wells Fargo, and there's a lot of richness on the record about how these brokers who are no longer at Wells Fargo, but they have statements saying that they particularly targeted black families and black communities. And if we look at the history of segregation, we see that it was so geographically possible. It was easy because Baltimore was so segregated, and it wasn't segregated through the 1800s. It was segregated when they passed the first racial segregation ordinance in the early 1900s. And so because of that, that's less than 100 years later, it's hardly surprising then that areas are targeted for these loans. And then along with that, then it opens up the door to the idea, well, the suburbs were able to, so of course the segregation happens and the resources move to the suburbs, but the suburbs were able to keep the resources away from the inner cities because Detroit, Baltimore, all these places, and people incorporated the suburbs separately. So this way all the taxes stayed where they were. And then Detroit becomes a really interesting example of that because there's newspaper articles from Detroit Free Press, and there's newspaper articles from the early 1900s about op-eds and whatnot by the white people in the suburbs, basically saying that they're entitled to this, that of course we want to keep our borders like this because we shouldn't have to give money to Detroit, not even recognizing that all of their jobs and everything comes from Detroit, right? That they're entirely dependent. The reason why they have a suburb is because Detroit exists.
There's no sub without the herb.
And so then there's a Milliken case, which then allows the Detroit suburbs to do that, right? To keep the resources separate within the suburb, and so they don't have to then allow students to be bussed around, and they don't have to consider themselves integrated. So I follow it. This paper, my paper also, just became too enormous. So I follow it, and it's going to be in a separate project, or I'll turn this into a book, and it'll be a separate thing, but it'll be a separate chapter. But it's so important to tell both at the same time, because it's just impossible to conceive of the wealth that's in some of these suburbs around the industrial towns without acknowledging how then the towns were constructed and then deconstructed through the 1900s.
I did find one more thing, I'm sorry. I just thought of something else. When I looked at foreclosures along income levels, it really did make a difference in terms of the types of lending discriminations that were involved. It's because of the attitudes that, hey, if they're going to give me money for a loan, I'm just going to take it, that a lot of minorities have. And in places like Prince George's County, Maryland, where you have the highest African American income level, and in that neighborhood you had a lot of foreclosures that went on as well. So that was kind of the biggest surprise for me, that income level didn't really matter. So you have a larger tax base, but still you have a problem with foreclosures and lending discrimination.
Thank you.
And can I just say one thing to that too? And there's also, kind of the effect of white flight on black wealth, and the fact that it's hard for middle-class African Americans to count on wealth in their homes when kind of white people leave and take the tax base away. In fact, there was an article that came out a few weeks ago that said it's not a good investment for black people to buy homes because those homes are not going to be able to hold their value, and they'll go underwater and
I might disagree.
Go upside down.
I had a question for Professor Gupta too. I was wondering if the pervasiveness of the rhetoric, you talked about how suburbs are like this key pinnacle separation from the city. If that's kind of changing because now a lot of the inner ring suburbs too are becoming a lot more poor and a lot more colored, and so I didn't know if you saw there's like a separation, how like manuals or current rhetoric is kind of changing in new codes.
There's definitely a separation, there's definitely changes in what happens in the world, and you're absolutely right about then the inner ring suburbs now are changing, and so minorities are moving outward. But from what I've seen of the rhetoric in policies, it hasn't really changed in prizing the single-family house in this detached, wonderful world as the pinnacle. And so during the Clinton era that Aleatra talked about, there was also statements made by Cisneros, the head of HUD at the time, that talks about a staircase that people, going from homeless to shelter and so on. And at the top of the staircase, of course, a single-family home in this idyllic place. And so I think that definitely things change, also because now workplaces are not just in the cities. So once workplaces move to the suburbs, then transportation changes and lots of things change. And there's a lot of gender effects on gender as well. But I still think that it hasn't changed this core idea of what is the ideal, and then also it hasn't changed what we were just talking about with the separation of wealth, because now perhaps it'll just be that there are very wealthy suburbs, and then there are suburbs that are not so much, and those lines are drawn.
You have a question?
Yeah, this is for Professor Gupta also. When we think of suburb, we tend to jump to post-World War II, and like the houses that you showed. But there was a lot of suburban development before that, particularly in the Rust Belt cities, right? And this sort of ring development. So I'm wondering if your project looks at all at these sort of turn of the 20th century, early 20th century suburban developments and what happens to them.
To be honest, I've looked at that because I felt like I needed to know that history, but because I was looking so much at this house as the norm and how it just proliferated during World War II or during the New Deal, I really wanted to start with, well, when was it that the lending policies changed in a way that made it more affordable? And so it was during that time that then mortgages became, you used to have to put down like 50% in order to buy a house. And so it was during that time that then the government, because of government support, mortgages became this 20% that we see today. And it was during that time that the government started underwriting. And so I've looked at that just for my own knowledge to see, well, how was the divide between country and city already shifting from the 1800s onward? And also, where did that house even come from? Because it's not like the house itself was built only in that time period. The house itself was already existing, and I've read literature that actually traces it back to London of all places, which I hadn't realized, but that it was actually now it's within London, but then it was just outside the city of London, which would be where Hampstead Heath is now. But that was considered the country, and so people started building these houses that had little lawns there, and that was in the 1800s, and then that comes to the States in various places, and then also there's the growth that you talked about.
Well, let me suggest that at least one reason why it would be valuable to look at what today I think we call them inner suburbs or inner ring suburbs, that because these suburbs are already established, they are separately incorporated, right? They're not part of the city. Mm-hmm. That when we start looking at the Fair Housing Acts in 1960s, and because these suburbs tend to border the city, that these are really the first suburbs where if we're having a migration of minorities out of the city and into the suburbs, that this is what happens. And it happens at this time when we have these fair housing laws come on the books, and how these established suburbs react to that change in law, a change in lending, and change in migration, I think is a very, very important part of this history. And I'm originally from Cleveland, so those would be the suburbs that I know best. So Shaker Heights is often put forward as being one of the most successfully integrated suburbs during that time. I'll leave off the question of whether you think Shaker's that great today. whereas East Cleveland is very unsuccessfully, and they were just in the news yesterday as being unable to pay the bill for red light cameras. You know, so that it's been a steady decline in East Cleveland, and in fact the East Cleveland versus Moore case is a lot about East Cleveland that the court never even really knew. So I'm suggesting that you might take a look at those. Detroit had a lot of those inner suburbs, to kind of see where your story goes there when you're looking at those areas.
That's really helpful. And that also brings sorry?
Inglewood is an example of that too.
Inglewood would be a very good example here. Although the suburban development of Los Angeles is a little bit different. Yeah, I don't know if you know Becky Nicolaitis' work on Los Angeles.
Yeah, and actually, oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm just going to say, just most of the areas that surround South Central, like Compton, all those cities, Linwood, those Southgate, those were suburbs or inner suburbs, you will, Inglewood, as the young lady mentioned before. So I guess that would be somewhat of a parallel to East Cleveland or Shaker Heights. That's what comes to mind when I think of, those type of inner suburbs that were once white.
Although a lot of those are post-World War
now.
II, or they're around. Yeah, they're not as early as those, but yeah.
I'm from Linwood, so that I think the city's history dates back to like 1890. So I mean, I think there's some cities that have that, early history. It was like a Spanish colonial settlement at that point in time. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I was going to just jump in too with this conversation, because I think to defend the post-World War II moment, as well as many people sort of talked about that being one of the greatest mass migrations of people out of the Rust Belt, out of these industrial cities to these low-density cities in the West, right? Not just Los Angeles, but Phoenix, Denver. These are the fastest growing cities post-World War II, and so I think there's something there as well, moving from the dense industrial Northeast to the Sun Belt, as part of the construction, both the New West and the New South, which is also tied to this story.
Yes. I'm the executive director of the Housing Rights Center, the largest fair housing organization in the country. And for 22 years I've been practicing CERIC law, and it's always been an inner struggle with me, and that is HUD and every fair housing organization has always been the main goal is integration. Segregation is bad, and even though that's been my work, it's always been the kind of an interpersonal struggle with me because of the ill effects of integration, especially on African Americans. And I'm just wondering if you've seen something, have read something, if you're writing anything on what we're seeing gentrification. Los Angeles is a perfect example. Washington D.C. is another example. Brooklyn of the flight of African Americans or the displacement of African Americans from those communities where they at one point held majorities population-wise, and now Los Angeles is only like 6 or 7% African American, and the height it was 25%. D.C. was at 1.70% African American. Now it's about 35% African American. And the loss of wealth that went with that's gone with that, and whether or not we should still, as a country, be focused on integration as a goal, because these communities have now supposedly been integrated, but it has been at the harm of African Americans. So I'm just curious about that.
It has been interesting to me to see that, because I'm in Charleston, and Charleston's a very historic city in South Carolina, and of course, they started that war for state rights. But there is a lot of areas, new construction, where you had predominantly minority homeowners, and they're now being pushed out of those areas. And the cost of living in Charleston is very expensive, and my thought has been, where's everyone going? Because the average salary is not $30,000 for minorities in Charleston. So that is something that I haven't yet worked on, but it's something that's interesting to me to tackle.
One of the things that strikes me about what you're describing is the way in which these problems are kind of compounded by this legacy of local control and localism in the suburbs. Mm-hmm. So this first wave of white flight builds barriers between the suburb and the city, and cuts off resources, and makes things very local. And so this reverse, kind of sort of pushing of African Americans out of the city into the suburb. It's not just segregating them, but it's cutting them off from access to things like transportation. I mean, I'm from Atlanta where this is, just happening very quickly. And one of the things I notice when I go back home is that on the news is the steep rise in pedestrian accidents. So people who are walking in the suburbs, which aren't set up for walking, but they're trying to get to the bus stop or the Target or whatever, are being hit and killed by drivers. And this is a legacy of, the refusal of whites in the suburbs to, to allow the rapid transit, to come, a long history of, struggle around transit. And so there's something about the kind of localism of this original move to the suburbs, and that I think is really exacerbating the problems that you described.
We have room for one last official question before, it's already technically our lunch break, so if you need to leave, feel free, but if not, I'm sure the panelists are able to speak to you after, but I'm certain.
I'll try to make it brief. I had a question for, I guess, all the panelists in terms of what can be done to increase home ownership rates amongst minorities, young minorities particularly, and what do you think would be, likely to be implemented given our, current political and social climate, and that just kind of thought and think of any race conscious remedies for that.
So I'm going to start quickly, and then I'll sort of turn it over to some of our experts. But so when I talked about the book that I used to finish my class, the Robert Nerwith Shadow Cities book, he goes into 4 squatter communities around the nation, and he asked the question, would you want title? And you would think, and so this is part of a larger sort of global phenomenon of it's sort of a kind of a Western model and liberal democratic model of giving title to squatters, right? Formalizing title for squatters who sit on these lands. And for the vast majority of them, many say, no, we don't want title. We actually don't want ownership, right? At least in sort of the Western norm sense, because it creates. It sort of made me think Shirley, this is the plantation, right? That they might become part of. So I sort of raised the question, right? I mean, it's a threshold question, right? Do we need home ownership in the first place to achieve our goals? And if the answer is yes, then I think it gets to your question of how do we then increase it, in the service of racial justice.
I'll piggyback on that, and I say that minorities do need home ownership if you consider where network comes from, and it's still just a little bit of the whole picture it's a bigger picture of the whole picture for minorities. And I have looked at home ownership rates by age, and you're right, young minorities don't buy homes a lot. And one of the things I think that we need to do is increase fair access to credit, because we don't have a lot of net worth, therefore you need to borrow the money to purchase a home. And how do you do that? Well, we saw that, all of the agencies that were supposed to be minding the house did not. And so I guess they only had like 2 cases between 1993 and 2003, where they actually pursued an action for fair housing violations. So I think we need to, one, enforce those. The other thing I think that we need to do is pull back on that ability to repay rule that just went into place in January of this year, where you consider student loans as a part of the whole debt to income ratio. And then the last option, which is a little radical, is I think that there needs to be criminal sanctions against mortgage companies and bank lenders that violate the Fair Housing Act or the Equal Credit Opportunity Act.
So I'll be very quick. It's a huge question. In short, I think that there needs to be just more flexible forms of ownership and more flexible things to own. And so houses cannot be built the way they are right now. There has to be more shared space. There just has to be new models. And then ownership, it's crazy to me that one can put down less than 10% on a down payment and say that now one owns a house. And so the bank owns 90% of it and the bank can take it anytime. I don't know how that's called ownership, to be honest. And so if we were willing to be more flexible with what we call ownership and how we structure credit and how we structure equity, I think that maybe we'd get somewhere where housing tenure security is there first.
And I guess just very quickly, I'm going to sort of return to Tom's point, and if, you know, sort of stability, financial stability, looks like a certain percentage, a lower percentage of home ownership in one's portfolio. I mean, it seems like for whites have one profile, and everyone else has another profile in which home ownership constitutes like the bulk of the portfolio. I'd ask, you know, kind of, if, you know, coming out the other side of this property regime looks more in the way that whites do conveys a different sort of profile, what does it mean that we as racialized others continue to kind of insist on a profile that constitutes losing?
Right.
Thank you so much.